Good morning, everyone, and welcome to WWF's Living Planet Conference, themed Biodiversity Loss, the Next Wave. I'm Pavs Pillay, for those of you who don't know me, and I am a WWF worker bee, and it is my absolute pleasure and absolute delight to be hosting today's session. I'd like to actually start with just kind of setting the scene and asking you honestly if you know what biodiversity is. You know, we take it for granted that people know what biodiversity is, they understand its significance to their lives, and they know what the impact will be if we lose all the biodiversity on our planet. But, you know, don't feel like you're alone in the room, in the virtual room, if you don't really know what biodiversity means and how it underpins our lives. Because in 2010, when the UN actually called that year the Year of Biodiversity, a university in the UK called the University of Cumbria, actually through their research on awareness and understanding of terminology, they did some really fundamental research with the UK citizens, and they asked them, what is biodiversity, or what is the understanding of biodiversity? And you'll be surprised to know that the most common answer was that biodiversity is a type of washing powder. I was very surprised to read that research because I think intrinsically, I just believe that everybody understands what biodiversity is. And then I thought, all right, let me ask a few experts. So I went and I asked a few experts, what is biodiversity? And the response I got was, biodiversity is the biological diversity of our planet. So I thought, all right, let me ask Google. And I Googled it. And the top response that I got was, biodiversity is the biological variety and variability of all life on Earth. Now, you know, these responses reminded me, and I want to use this analogy because it talks about biodiversity, of a scene in The Lion King, the animation, where the lion Nala is trying to explain to Pumbaa, the warthog, and Timon, the meerkat, exactly who Simba's uncle is. And the dialogue goes something like this. Nala says, Simba is returning to the Pride Lands to challenge Scar. And Timon responds, who is Scar? And Nala answers, his uncle. Pumbaa then asks, who's his uncle? And he says, Scar. So it's a zero value added conversation. So what exactly is biodiversity for us to fully understand this? Well, biodiversity is all forms of life on our planet, from the plants to the animals, it includes the insects, includes bacteria, and most importantly, it includes human beings. What is even more significant is that biodiversity underpins our very ability to meet our basic needs. And losing it actually threatens our survival. And I read something very interesting where they explained it wonderfully, and they said biodiversity is your life support system. So for most of us, when we think about biodiversity loss, we think about the demise of the rhino, or maybe a whale species, or some far-flung rainforest frog. But we never understand how it affects our lives. And I'd like to do this by illustrating, by painting a picture. Recently, my niece sent me a picture, and this photograph showed people standing in apple trees. These trees were in full blossom in an orchard, and they were standing in apple trees with these long sticks. And she asked me, as she often does, she says, my WWF aunt, please can you explain to me, what are these people doing in these trees? Now, I will never miss an opportunity to enlighten a millennial city slicker. So I asked, well, what do you think they're doing in the trees? And our answers range from they're picking the blossoms off the apple trees to they're climbing trees and just having fun. And then, after a long dramatic pause, I responded to her, actually, they're hand pollinating the apple trees because there are no longer enough bees to do that job. And immediately, there was shock and absolute silence on her side because she loves apples. And now there was the dawning realization of what could happen if we lost all our bees. And then she said, this is unacceptable. And I thought, all right, But this was very quickly followed by, what can I do? And there was the glimmer of hope for me. So today we're going to be talking about hashtag why nature counts. And we're going to be listening to organizations and people that are doing some on the ground, really phenomenal work around restoring nature, halting biodiversity, creating those green corridors, greening our urban environments, protecting our natural land and seascapes. The conference is definitely going to give you 100% value. And most importantly, it's going to highlight how we operate and grow so that we can then function in a world that is resilient, where nature and humans thrive. I guarantee you that at the end of this conference, nobody's going to think biodiversity is a washing powder, but you're going to fully understand its importance to our lives. Before I hand over to our esteemed speakers, just a few points of courtesy. You will note that we will be taking questions in the Q&A if you're on Zoom, so please don't refrain from sharing those questions. We'll try to get to most of them. If you notice, you'll also see that the Zoom function has a chat function. So please use the chat function, engage with other people in the virtual room, begin a conversation and a dialogue around what is being said. If you're joining us from YouTube or Facebook, welcome. And please use the comment section. Your questions will be passed on to us. And then please look out for the polls as well. We really want to hear from you. It's a very different setting because we're all virtual. So please, answer the polls. We'll gather that data. We'll share some of those stats. And then as much as I can't hear, I would really, really want your questions. So please don't hold back. Please enjoy. And on that note, I would like to hand over to the CEO of WWF South Africa and our trusted leader, Dr. Morne du Plessis. Thank you.
Good day, everyone. A warm welcome.
Morne, it seems you've muted yourself.
Are you hearing me, Puffs?
Yes, perfectly. Thank you.
Can I go ahead?
Yes.
Good morning, everyone.
Sorry, guys, please just hold on. We've got a bit of an issue. Just hold on.
apologize.
What's
There were two screens on the app. So if
Oh.
we will, we are just waiting for them to confirm, but we'll restart again.
Ladies and gentlemen, as it is with technology, we're having a few glitches. There seem to be a gremlin in our streaming system with some technical difficulties. Please be patient with us. Hopefully we'll have it sorted shortly, and then we'll get Mornay back online once again. We do apologize for any inconvenience. This is new to us, doing stuff virtually, so I guess these gremlins are gremlins we haven't actually run into before. In the meantime, you can make yourself a cup of coffee, which is always great because you're either at home or you're in the office where you can rush and quickly make yourself a lovely cup of coffee before joining us. We will be there shortly. Thank you. Welcome back, everyone. Sorry about those technical difficulties. It seems the problem lies with the CVent app. For those of you that are on the app, we're asking people to please move across to our YouTube channel. We will be sending out a message on the app as well to ask people to migrate to the YouTube channel, as the CVent app unfortunately seems to not be streaming very effectively. On that note, I can now once again have the honor of handing over to the CEO of WWF South Africa, Dr. Morne du Plessis. Over to you, Morne. Ladies and gentlemen, the gremlins continue and we seem to have lost Morne once again. Please bear with us. I think we'll eventually get hold of Morne as soon as we can. The joys of technology and the digital world that we are operating in. If I can ask our technical team to please give Morne rights to switch on his camera and unmute himself. It seems he's back online. There he is. Now we just need Morne to be unmuted, please. Thank you. Welcome,
There we
Morne. There we go. Over to you.
Right, everyone, you would have thought that the CEO has been cowering in his office, but thank you very much for hanging in there with us. Good morning and good evening to those elsewhere in the world. Warm welcome to WWF South Africa's Living Planet Conference of 2021. Just over a week ago, the IPCC released its 6th report, in which the scientific basis of human-induced climate change is not only reinforced in the realm of fact, but the significance of the findings can no longer be ignored. In short, climate change is already with us. It's widespread, it's rapid, and it's intensifying. What is less often spoken about is the very direct link between climate change and the consequences of our picking at the seams of nature. We have to focus on reducing carbon emissions on the one hand, but importantly, we have to simultaneously sustain and restore the integrity of our natural systems. Biodiversity is the very fabric of nature. It's what keeps our natural systems functioning and what keeps them healthy. These systems are the foundation of human life, for human health, our jobs, and our economies. We also depend on nature for our everyday needs, such as food, water, energy, and fiber. You know all of this. I don't need to reinforce this. But the evidence is clear through climate change that's happening around us and biodiversity loss, that the consequences of our severely compromised natural systems are deep and dire. They include floods, fires, droughts, food shortages, and even pandemics. As we count the waves of coronavirus infection in South Africa, we are now still in our third wave. During this conference, we shall ask whether biodiversity loss should be or could be the next and most devastating wave of them all. Over the next few days, we've curated an array of voices, each backed by the latest science, who will talk about how and why nature counts for our climate, our economy, our culture. With international experts from Hong Kong, Kenya, Singapore, South Africa, Zambia, and more, we will bring you a mix of thought-provoking keynote speakers and panel experts to respond to important questions. We will also convene a collaborative discussion of the top leaders in South Africa's conservation sector. Together, they will discuss how we can increase action towards a nature-positive future. Our conference will culminate on Thursday, the 26th of August, in the announcement of this year's WWF South Africa's Living Planet Award to a truly outstanding individual who has extensively contributed to our cause. And for the first time ever, we'll bestow a new award to an organization whose contribution to people and nature is deserving of our acknowledgement and praise. As always, WWF and our Living Planet Conference presents an opportunity to celebrate the beauty and bounty of South Africa's own biological richness. South Africa counts among the top 17 so-called megadiverse countries globally. It has 3 of the world's 35 biodiversity hotspots. It also has the world's only arid hotspot that holds a staggering 30% of all the succulent plant species found on Earth. But as we count nature's abundance and count on nature's value, we must over the next days and beyond continue to ask whether nature can in turn count on us. It's now my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker to open the WWF South Africa Living Planet Conference of 2021. Kavita Prakash Mani is CEO of Mandai Nature, an organization that advances efforts in nature conservation and climate mitigation in Singapore and Southeast Asia. Kavita has broad experience across the corporate, consulting, and non-profit environmental sector. Until recently, I was privileged to call her a colleague when she was Global Conservation Director of WWF International. Prior to that, she served as the WWF International Markets Practice Leader. Before joining WWF, Kavita held several global positions, including Executive Director of Grow Asia in Singapore, supporting sustainable and inclusive agriculture development in Southeast Asia, Head of Food Security Agenda at Syngenta, the Agriculture Technology and Innovation Company, and also as a Vice President of Sustainability in London, a strategy consultancy and research think tank focused on corporate responsibility and sustainable development. We're delighted that Kavita has agreed to open our Living Planet Conference for 2021. And with a bit of luck, I now hand over to Kavita to take us forward into the next section.
Thank you, Mornay. It was a privilege to call you a colleague, but it's a greater privilege to call you a friend, and especially one based in South Africa, which by far is one of my favorite countries from a personal as well as a nature conservation and biodiversity perspective. So let me kick off with a presentation to just give you an overview of where we are. And hopefully what I will be able to present to you in the next little while will set the stage for what you see in the coming days in terms of the importance of nature, biodiversity, its link into climate change, and of course, what it means for all of us, all of humanity, and how we can thrive together. So what we have really looking at on the next slide is what is biodiversity? So frankly, biodiversity is everything on Earth. It is the fabric of life, as Mornay said. We have about 8.7 million species of plants and animals in existence, but we only know about 1.2 million. And even within those 1.2 million, we are already at risk of losing most of them. So about 1 million are already at risk. We've lost 68% of our species across the globe in the last 40 years or so. So we have what we are looking at as the 6th mass extinction coming online alongside a number of other issues. So what we are then looking at in terms of the next slide is how we can figure out the climate impact. We've been hearing about the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, but we have fires raging across the world. If you start from California, you can make your way down the west coast of the US, you can go across to Europe in Spain, you can go across to Greece. Across the world, we've been seeing fires. About 2.5 million hectares have already been devastated in the fires in California. In 2019, when we were looking at the fires in Australia, we had about 25 million hectares lost, but also 3 billion animals lost their lives in that, and numerous people were made homeless. So this devastation is not a one-off. It is, as Mornay said, an IPCC report has predicted that climate change, human-induced climate change, is here to stay. On one end, we have fires, and on the other end, we have floods. So if you're looking at it from the context of what's happening on the flood side of things, we can see in Europe where you have Germany and Belgium over the course of a day seeing about 19% more rain than they've ever seen, and 9% more risk of such weather situations, unprecedented weather situations. And it's not just climate change, because climate change and nature are two sides of the same coin. If we have started destroying our mangroves, if we have started building hard infrastructure on our coastlines, if our river systems and our wetlands have lost their capacity to absorb that water, to act as defenses against sea surges, we will see more and more of these. So while we are looking at climate impacts, we are also looking at how we build resilience to those climate impacts through different ways of nature-based services. And then we start looking at it in the context of our marine system. So if you look at coral reefs, then we start seeing on the next slide how we might actually impact the marine system through climate change, but also through environmental disasters. So if you, I hope many of you have had the chance to go and see the Australian coral reef, the Great Barrier Reef. About a third of it was lost in 2016 due to a bleaching because of heating up of the waters due to climate change. Another third was also lost more recently, and we have had about 1,500 mile-long bleaching. When we start moving towards what it means for us, we've heard about COVID. I don't need to tell you guys about what is happening around the world. We have if you go to the next slide, about 212 million cases globally, and about 4.5 million deaths globally. So this obviously is playing out very differently across the world, and there is a lot of talk now about vaccine diplomacy and the have and the have-nots. You've seen the third peak happening in South Africa. Here in Singapore, where I'm based, we are a little more protected. We're a much smaller island and very close to outside, so we can manage it. But this is not the first pandemic, and it'll definitely not be the last. Whether it's Ebola, it's MERS, it's bird flu, it's swine flu, we've had many, and many more will come. But why is that? Why are we seeing these flus? So as you can see on the next slide, it really comes down to what we have in terms of the wet market. We have animals living cheek by jowl next to each other in unsanitary conditions that have been brought into the market for meat, but also for various other reasons. We as humans are going into nature. We are cutting down forests, our livestock, which now accounts for almost 90% of all mammals by weight, is way more in contact with some of these species, be it pangolins or bats or great apes, that are then spreading these viruses, jumping these viruses into our system and impacting us. We need to respect those borders of nature. We need to have nature be able to count on us. And then if you look at the illegal wildlife trade, so just on the next slide, you see illegal wildlife trade is now the 4th largest trade in the world after guns, drugs, and people. So we have about 100 tigers, 1,000 rhinos, 20,000 elephants being killed every day for trade. And you may wonder why we're buying these or what we're doing with all of this wildlife. But you can buy them as food, as we were talking about, but you can also buy them for things of beauty, ivory, traditional systems, and beautiful products being made by ivory. You can also buy them as, in traditional medicine, because people believe that pangolin scales or rhino horns can cure everything from fever to cancer. You can also have them, birds are being traded here in Southeast Asia because of birds competition. They're beautiful singing birds, like the Bali Maina or the starlings, which are now being captured, and the forests are going silent because we want them in our cages and we want to compete with them. There are many reasons why we capture wildlife, but seriously, wildlife needs to be left in its own space for their sake and for our sake. And what does it mean for us? What are we doing? So as we see, we are outliving the resources of the planet by 60%. As the figure on the next slide shows, that 60% overrun has come from where we used to be earlier in 1970, just about using 75% of our resources. We're now at 160% of the resources being used. So we're living beyond the capacity of our planet. One example of how we are living beyond our means is to look at agriculture and our food system. So from our next slide, we have what is the food system? It is nothing but an amalgamation of environmental resources converted together to create calories and other vitamins and minerals and elements for us. 80% of global deforestation is due to agriculture. It uses about 70% of fresh water. 50% of fisheries come from nature. You can look at all the numbers that we might have. And in fact, IUCN has said that bird and mammal extinction risk, 80% of those are threatened by agriculture in the cause of these threats. So we can really look at, what sustains us at a most primal level is also what is destroying some of our natural resources and our biodiversity. The picture on the next slide is something that always gets to me when you start looking at, the spread of agriculture into our tropical forests, and especially when you're here in Southeast Asia and you can see palm oil, which is there in every single product that we buy, being really looked at in terms of how we can be deforesting our natural environment. 12.2 million hectares of tropical forest was lost just in 2019. That's about 10% of global tree cover being lost since 2000, since the turn of the century. Forests provide us food, medicines, wood, fiber, employment, fresh water, clean air, precipitation, you name it. The tropical forests are literally the heart and the lungs of our world. And they also provide 1/3 of climate solutions. So if we're looking at fighting climate change, we have to be looking at protecting our different habitats, especially our tropical forests and wetlands. If we shift to fisheries, 1/3 of our commercial fisheries are overfished. we are way beyond what they can sustain. About 90% are fully exploited. So we're at the line of where we can just about maintain it, and there's no give in that system. We have species like bluefin tuna that are almost at risk of extinction, and plunged 97% in the last things. So if we start looking at that food system more holistically, we realize that it is both an impact of global warming that is impacting these fisheries due to the impact of hotter waters on the spawning grounds, on the small fish, but also in sheer just removal of these fish for our consumption that is devastating all our fisheries and our oceans. But it's not all doom and gloom. We know how to deal with these things. We have a number of really positive examples of how we have really come around and managed to get back some of our wildlife, our biodiversity, and our species. So the next slide is an example that I'm sure many of you have heard of. This is one of the success stories in Yellowstone National Park in the US, where we had killed off the main predator of the park, the wolves, in the 1930s. But then in 1995, the wolves were reintroduced into the park. And you would think that if you bring back the predators, then their prey, like elk, which had been thriving when they were gone, would really be decimated. But what was interesting was, well, the elk thrived, though they had to look at different foraging grounds. But because they were moved out of areas like the river system and the grasslands, other plant species came back. As the plant species came back, other mammal species came back, like the beavers, that then in turn impacted the rivers and built dams that enabled other smaller species, cleaner waters, getting the water system to be more in tune with the needs of the land. And suddenly you have a very flourishing ecosystem in what could have been just another declining biodiversity space. So it matters, but it can be done. Example closer to my heart is India, where I'm from. We had tigers that were almost lost. So in the last 150 years, about 90-95% tigers have been lost, and the range of tigers has come down to very few, 13, 14 locations just in Asia. But in 1973, we had the government of India start Project Tiger. They started creating tiger reserves, protecting areas, getting more rangers into space. NGOs kicked in, human-wildlife conflict issues with local communities were being dealt with. A lot of effort went into that. And now, of course, South Africa has its own amazing safaris, but I would urge you all to go look at the tigers in India. They're absolutely magnificent. We have almost 3,000 tigers in India, which, good and bad, is about 70% of all wild tigers. So we only have about 4,000 tigers, which is actually less than the tigers we have in captivity as pets and for their body parts in the rest of the world, but still a success story in the context of India. And even closer home, we have the pandas. So as you can see, we had a really amazing success just about 10 days ago in Singapore Zoo, where a little baby panda was born, yet to be named, yet not sure whether it's a boy or a girl. But after many years of trying with this pair of pandas that was brought over from China as part of China's panda diplomacy, we did have a little baby born. Now, the panda is, of course, the giant panda, the logo of WWF. And one of the first success stories that WWF has contributed to. So this has been a success because the Chinese government, working with NGOs like WWF, has done a lot to protect the habitat, look at assisted reproduction, and look at conservation efforts that brought this species back from the brink of extinction to that extent that it has now been upgraded from being endangered to vulnerable. So a long way to go still, but a success story nonetheless. But these are very specific, singular issues on species. To protect species and to protect our whole biodiversity, we actually need to protect the habitats. We've been talking about forests, but as urbanization, as agriculture, as mining and industrialization has been extending, we have been converting our land and our seascape. About 75% of land and 66% of our marine spaces have been altered by man. we've lost, 85% of our wetlands have been lost. The Amazon rainforest, which is, our prime lung, has lost 17% of the forest itself. And we've been looking at topsoil and losing that. So, we can go on around these numbers, but what can we do about them? So, of course, we must first protect them. We are talking about protecting 30% of our different habitats across the terrestrial space, and we have only about 15% in land and 7% in oceans. But we must also connect them, because as we're getting these small parcels of land, we need to be able to allow migration between these things, to allow the connectivity for these species to thrive. This is just one photograph of a very urban landscape here in Singapore, where an overbridge is connecting two remaining land of secondary forests in Singapore to allow species, small species that could be, the monkeys and langurs, or it could be pangolins, which we find in Singapore, or many birds that are starting to use these thoroughfares that have been built specially for them. But again, it's not just about people, about species and habitats. It's about people. It's about us. And so this is a photograph of one of the projects that we support in Indonesia with an organization called Planet Indonesia, which really started bottom up and said, if we want conservation, we need to work with the people. Indigenous peoples, local communities, the ones that are on the front line of conservation, that have traditionally lived in these very biodiverse areas and have a vested interest in protecting them. But they must also see a benefit. And so we've been working on many of these projects to see how can we create that benefit, that engagement, that income, that alternate livelihood for these communities to be rewarded and awarded for the protection of these habitats. So be it as rangers, which we're seeing a lot of community rangers here, be it as smaller, income generation activities like food production, beehives, honey collection, artisanal products. So we need to be looking at that in a number of ways and building on that traditional knowledge that they have that can help us protect these and use these even more. Because after all, these are the forests that give us our crops, our medicines, and everything else that we've been talking about. A specific example that we have around these kind of communities is to see around small scale agriculture. I mean, Mone mentioned that I used to run Grow Asia, which is really focused on small scale, smallholder farmers. But these farmers who are at, in these landscapes with these very unique biodiverse regions are actually one of the greatest threats to our biodiversity. They are primarily between them and some of the bigger ones, plantations, the ones that are responsible for a large part of the deforestation. So working with them, helping them get better production, better outcomes, better incomes for their products, or even alternate products that they can grow on their farms is absolutely critical to ensure that we have success and that we are working to address one of the core reasons of the destruction of nature, which is poverty. And so we have 500 million smallholder farmers in the world, and they support about 2.5 billion people. So you can see about a third of our world population is dependent on smallholder agriculture, which is then, really rooted in our forests and our tropical landscapes. So how can we look at new ways of agroforestry or agroecology and look at different ways of agriculture that both produce for us, but also protect for us? Similarly, if you look at fisheries, we have small-scale fisheries, which are, again, the mainstay. These fisheries are very dependent on coral reefs or mangroves or, other spawning grounds to create those fisheries. We know from a lot of work that has been done across the world on these communities that we need to work on marine protected areas to ensure that we have, replenishment of our fish stock, that we can trace where our fish comes from. It's a big ocean, and very often we feel we can't see it, so it doesn't count. But even more so, working with these communities because it's in their self-interest for those fisheries to thrive. So many interesting examples there. And a bit closer to your home is, an example that I think is very amazing in terms of valuing nature, which we do best through tourism. Tourism is, in fact, where you see the quality of our protection of nature and the biodiversity really converting into economic value. So according to the World Tourism Organization, about 7% of world tourism relates to wildlife tourism. That is growing at about 3%. And I can bet post-COVID, given we can't all travel right now, a lot of people will want to go back into nature, into being with nature, into the healing that we get from nature and the peace that we get from nature. So we will just see it once we are able to travel, bounding back. So about $120 billion of global GDP is created through this singular tourism impact that we have, which is much bigger than anything else that we might be looking at. So what can governments do about this? The governments, of course, as we've been saying, just showing you on the map on the next slide, is where we have protected areas. So the first thing that we're calling from under the Convention of Biological Diversity is to protect 30% of land and 30% of our seas. And we said, as you can see on this map, only 15% of terrestrial land and about 7% of the oceans is currently protected, because that will then enable us to ensure that intact forests, the most biodiverse forests, and all other ecosystems, grasslands, wetlands, peatlands, coral reefs, are all protected. And they then in turn are able to replenish and re-engineer some of our biodiversity. A very good example that we have is from Belize, where due to a lot of pressure from NGOs and local communities and the people themselves, were to protect these absolutely amazing coral reefs that we have there. So a picture on the next slide will show you that these UNESCO World Heritage Site, a string of 7, they have whale sharks, coral atolls, manatees, they have blue-footed boobies, a lot of really biodiverse things. And it was due to a lot of local pressure, but then the government stepped up to say, we will not allow oil and gas exploration in our protected area system. And that has in turn built an amazing impact on how that nature has bounced back, what it has brought for their tourism, because about, if you look at the numbers that they had, about 35% of all jobs in Belize are dependent on tourism. So it has a big economic value that is more widespread by protection than by oil and gas exploration that would then get it into the hands of few. So government action really does matter. But corporate action is also very important. So if you look at the next slide, where we see when we talked about deforestation and said, why are we having deforestation? As you will see, one of the biggest reasons why we have deforestation is around commodity and agriculture. So in Africa, it is really driven by smallholder agriculture. In Asia and in other parts of the world, it is really driven by plantations. So you can see across Brazil and across Indonesia and countries like this, it's plantations, whether it's soy or beef or palm oil or coffee or cocoa, that is driving a lot of this deforestation. This brings it back to really working with the companies, their value chains, and through those value chains with all the producers that we have, of ensuring that we have no deforestation in our commodities, in our production of our food. Now, this was a commitment made by the consumer good companies. It is still to be seen whether they will be able to do it. They missed their 2020 deadline, but there is now even more pressure from governments and consumers for that corporate action to take place. But it's not all about the companies either. It's about you and me. And so the latest report from WWF, which talks about a plant-based diet, shows this amazing graph that shows about what we can actually do to improve our food system. So one is, of course, we should shift our diets. Not saying everyone needs to be vegetarian, but being lower on the food chain does matter. So we have a lot more deforestation and a lot higher footprint when we have a meat-based diet. So, slowing it down, replacing it by meat, and if you replacing it by plants and having more sustainable meat when you choose to have meat. Food loss and waste, 30% of our food is either lost on the farm or wasted by consumers. That absolutely has to stop. And then, of course, on top of that is the thing about sustainable production, so that we have the best use of our land in the most sustainable way for the highest productivity, protecting everything else. And then just to round it off, when we are looking at our choices matter, personal choices matter. So plastics is one of the biggest things that is the scourge of the earth right now. We have about 8 million tons going into the oceans every day. And if we think about what we eat, what we wear, whether we use plastic, are we recycling, are we upcycling, are we just reducing the demand for our products and not getting into this competition about consumerism? Are we equitably sharing the resources of the world with us and our neighbors, whether they're countries or just next door neighbors? Are we holding companies to account for how they are producing and making choices by the dollar that we spend to go to sustainable products? Are we electing governments that are committed to the environment and then holding them to account for actually delivering against those commitments? We as consumers, we as individuals, we as citizens of the world have a choice, and we should be using it to make a change on a personal level, but also on a global level, to show that we do value nature and nature can count on us. I'm going to end with a very sweet little video, which is just my favorite from here in Singapore, showing Cape penguins in the Singapore Zoo that were able to use the space of the zoo in the times of COVID, but the zoo itself was shut. My favorite species, and brings me so much closer to all of you in South Africa. With that, I'm going to leave it there and say thank you for the opportunity to share some thoughts with you today, and very happy to take any questions. Pams, over to you.
Thanks, Kavita. And wow, thank you for that. It was inspirational, but at the same time, a big kind of wake-up call on what we're actually doing to our planet. I forget those numbers very often. And then when you reminded them, I was scribbling down, trying to go, sure, that doesn't leave much room, and we got to start working. Before I jump into some questions, and there's some great ones that have come through, I just wanted to let you know that, you know, when I joined WWF 6 years ago, I Googled WWF in the network. And in one of my searches, you actually came up in a YouTube video. And I remember watching that video and listening to you. And then I thought, oh my God, this woman is amazing. She's done such phenomenal work from Syngenta all the way to WWF. And I thought, whatever, I would love to meet her and just have a cup of coffee. And it seems like it's my bucket list has been ticked, because here I sit moderating a Q&A with you. And it's such a pleasure to hear you speak and hear your passion when it comes to the environment and what we need to do. So thank you, Kavita. It's so appreciated from both WWF South Africa, but also from a personal note on my side. So we have some really interesting questions.
I am still going to hold Mornay. He still owes me a visit to some of the WWF South Africa sites. So you all are still going to have to host me at some point.
No, definitely. Most certainly will. With the greatest of pleasure, we'll host you and we'll show you those penguins that you so love. So, Kavita, there's been a lot of talk around protecting areas and safeguarding those spaces and those resources. And, the question is around how do we actually incentivize to protect those areas, both at the national level, so at government, but also, very often protected areas are where communities exist, where they function, where they've been part of those protected areas. And I think this question around incentivizing is, how do we incentivize these various actors to actually protect those habitats?
It's a really good question, Pams, and I think it's not an easy question. So I think first and foremost, I think, what we have always thought of as protection needs to be better understood. So I think those days are gone when we could actually put a boundary or a fence around a geography and then keep everyone out. I think, we need to get to a model where we're looking at more community conserved areas, where we're looking at the rights of the people who live there and have traditionally lived there and have traditionally protected these areas, so that they can continue to thrive within that. So I think our models of what protection needs to evolve, and there needs to be some amount of available use within that landscape, so that we are not being anti-people and pro-environment, or being seen as being just about the animals. So we need to find those models, and I think they exist. And I think we've seen that if you empower people and you give them the rights, then they themselves step up and create that kind of barrier to, say, against poaching or against destruction of the habitats. And of course, there needs to be an economic incentive. And I think we should be paying for ecosystem services. We should be paying for nature-based solutions for climate so that people feel proud about these things that they own, but also get the benefit from them. So again, I think we need to really experiment in this space.
No, definitely, Kavita. And something that you said resonated with me, in that we need to listen to the folks, the indigenous knowledge, the people that are closest to where the issue is sitting, and listen with deep listening, and actually listen and then absorb what is being taken and involve them in actually the nature-based solution. I think we can't just impose a solution, especially, as as in Asia and in South Africa, communities are very much embedded in those areas that need protection. It's where their livelihoods is, their lives, they've been there generationally. And, asking them to change that and not having them have some buy-in or help drive that process is a big issue. And one of the questions are around, what are the challenges you'd faced when you'd worked with those communities that you mentioned in your slide show?
Yeah, it's funny, and it's slightly apolitical and non-PC, but I think we've all in South Africa and India, where I come from, we've all been, colonial powers have been in our countries and set systems for us. So we're all kind of like, we can do it ourselves. We know what's right for us, and you have to give people the right and empower them to find the systems that work. It needs to be really bottom up in that context. And I think, from my work across the world, really, it is really when you sit with these communities and you understand what their needs are, and you try and solve it from their perspective, not take our points of view to them. Because I think, you can collectively get to the outcome, but it is about saying, what are your needs? What does your family need? Where are you going to get the income to send your child to school? Where is your next meal going to come from? So it's not just about us saying, you will not destroy that forest, because we have already destroyed ours in the rest of the world. But really about saying, how do we work together to make that happen? And people come up with the most amazing ideas, and you can really have innovative ways of thinking. So whether it's coffee growers in say Brazil, or it's looking at smallholder palm oil plantation folks in Indonesia, all of them have very similar points of view, and I think it's just about finding with them the solutions, not for them the solutions.
Yeah. Kavita, I'm going to ask you a last question because we are running a bit late, but I think it's an important one. It's one that keeps coming up. And it's one from Glenda, who wants to know, well, why aren't we talking about our population size as a species? Is that not one of the biggest contributors to biodiversity loss? The destruction of forests, because obviously you have to feed, clothe, house, the bigger our population gets, the more the demands are on the planet. And, there's this whole idea, is that not a conversation we actually should be having as well?
That's absolutely a conversation we should be having as well. And I think it's not just an environmental issue. I think it's a social and equity issue as well. And I think when we talk about population, it is it's a women's issue. It is a development issue. It is very complex as a topic. But absolutely, I think the world cannot support 9 billion of us, or 10 billion, or however many we are now being looking at by the turn of the century. There has to be a self-correction in some ways, but that self-correction requires social development and economic development and some stability of work, so that people are fine with having smaller families. But it has taken some courage for some leading environmentalists to start talking about that in the context of the environmental agenda, because very often then it starts putting at loggerheads the social side and the environmental side. So we tread carefully in how we deal with it. But absolutely, that is one of the biggest crises we have right now, that the world cannot support so many of us, especially at the cost of other species.
Absolutely. And I mean, you made a very good point about, unless we can find that middle ground, that equilibrium, we're actually heading for disaster. And one of that ways is actually addressing our populations. Kavita, on that note, I have to say thank you, a heartfelt thank you from WWF South Africa, and obviously everybody attending, for your time, your energy, and your input. It was phenomenal. Every time I learn something new. So thank you. And once again, good luck.
Thank you very much. And I do hope that as Mandai Nature takes off, we're a new NGO, that we will work much more closely with our sisters and brothers across the ocean in Africa. So look forward to that. Thank you for inviting me, Pat.
Absolute pleasure. Thank you. And on that note, we're going to jump straight into our panel, just in the interest of keeping up with time. And I think Kavita has laid a wonderful foundation for what our panel is going to discuss. She mentioned that we're in the Anthropocene. She mentioned that we're actually in the middle of the 6th major extinction. We've lost 60% of our species. We're at the risk of losing another million if we are not careful. And what's important is that, this is solvable. This is fixable. And that's such an important message to start from. At the beginning of today, I asked you to talk about nature positive and about biodiversity. And now I ask you to talk about nature positive. So, what is nature positive? Well, just to kind of frame our discussion today, nature positive is about increasing the health and the abundance, the diversity and the resilience of all species, ecosystems, and societies. And we do that by halting and reversing nature loss. We conserve intact natural systems, we restore environments, and we fundamentally, and this is a really important one, and it came very, very clear through the presentation by Kavita, is that we need to fundamentally shift our production and consumption systems. And I like the fact that now we need to start talking in systems. And it is within this framework that we are going to have this very important conversation. And, while we don't have a unifying goal as yet, and I know that at the next COP15, with the next CBD COP15 happening at the end of October, one of the biggest points on the agenda is, like we've set carbon goals, like we've set sustainability development goals, are we now going to set a multilateral environmental agreement around biodiversity? And this conversation becomes very, very important. But having said that, while we're not yet there, we don't yet have that goal on paper, we have been doing lots of work on the ground, and we have been implementing nature positive projects. We have been hearing about these projects, and I think this panel is going to talk to those projects. We're going to share our achievements, our victories. We're going to celebrate the wins today, and we're going to glean some insight into what challenges we're actually experienced with those projects. And by way of introduction, for those of you who know Simon Sinek, who's a very inspirational speaker and somebody I closely follow, he says, leaders should always speak last. And he says that because he's alluding to the fact that our leaders must first listen to their colleagues, their employees, their supporters, their stakeholders, and their partners. But sometimes, as in the case here, I think leaders need to be heard first. And they need to share what they feel is their successes, the challenges, and the victories, especially when it comes to a conversation that is so important when it talks about our life support system and getting it back online. So for the next 40 to 50 minutes, we're going to have a lovely, lively coffee table discussion with the leaders of the South African National Biodiversity Institute, the United Nations Development Programme, the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, and WWF South Africa, of course. This is a very unique opportunity to have these great leaders and these good thinkers in the same room. But it's also a wonderful opportunity for you and I to do more than just listen. It's for you and I to participate in what can be a very catalytic conversation, and one that can spur lots of action. And something that somebody said to me, words can change behavior. So let's see if that happens today. What I will also bring your notes from is, once again, put the questions in the Q&A, use the comment section on Facebook and YouTube, and please look out for our polls, which will come through on your screen. Answer them. We'd love your feedback. And then, when I was asked to moderate this panel, I was terrified, absolutely terrified. But as my terror waned and my excitement mounted, I actually realized that, we have a phenomenal group of people on this panel today, and it's actually worth listening to them. They have years of knowledge, years of experience, and they're acting in the best stead of our planet. So First, a little apology to our panelists. I've had to cut your introductions rather short, purely because your careers are so illustrious, and so are your profiles. So very quickly, our panel today is Mr. Shonesani Munzhedzi, who is the CEO of SANBI, the South African Biodiversity Institute. Shoni has served as the Deputy Director for General for Biodiversity and Conservation at our National Department of Forestry, Fisheries, and the Environment. And he is a master negotiator when it comes to multilateral agreements. Welcome, Shoni. Second on our panel, pleasure. Second on our panel is Dr. Ayodele Odushola, who is the resident representative for the UNDP. Before this, he's actually a phenomenal economist who has a few books out. And he was very much the head of strategy and analysis team for the UNDP's Regional Bureau for Africa. As an economist, Ayo focuses on the dynamics of macroeconomics and the development economics pertaining to our continent, which is vitally important. Welcome, Ayo.
Thank you.
Then we have,
really a pleasure.
Thank you. Then we have Shamila Subramani. And I think, Shamila, I'm probably the person who gets the surname right. And you, Shamila is the Chief Sustainability Officer at the JSE, and she has wonderful career. She is specialized in corporate strategy and sustainability expert, and she has worked in the finance sector for many, many years. As a sustainability specialist, she's been a key contributor to the JSE's research on climate change, the potential for working at local markets in the trade of carbon credits and environment-related products, and the development of sustainability segment for the JSE and the Green Bonds Framework. And I've just named a few, but there's another string of other initiatives that Shamila works on after that. Welcome, Shamila.
Thank you, Pavs.
And finally, last but not least, Dr. Morne du Plessis, our illustrious leader at WWF South Africa. Morne has been the CEO since 2007. And he serves both globally and continentally on several of the WWF networks and committees and working groups. He's also been part of many of the WWF boards and other boards, such as the Netbank Green Trust Board, the Leslie Hill Succulent Karoo Trust, National Parks Trust of South Africa, Table Mountain Fund, and as well as the Mammal Research Institute at the University of Pretoria. And before joining WWF in a formal life, Morne was actually the director of the Percy Fitzpatrick Institute at the University of Cape Town, which as we know is a center of excellence. Welcome, Morne. So as you can see, we have a wonderful group of folks, and what better place to have this kind of discussion. As I promised, we're going to get 100% value from this discussion. So Shoni, I'm going to start with you. And, you know, I kind of looked at SANBI's director, and SANBI has biodiversity in its name. So it's to explore and celebrate and champion biodiversity for the benefit of us all. It's around monitoring our biodiversity, understanding that, you know, the state of our biodiversity is so important to South Africa. But nature and climate are pretty much two sides of the same coin. And there's no way that we can keep intact natural systems intact, in place, thriving, rich biodiversity without looking at the climate issue. And I know that SANBI has been working very hard as the kind of facility through the Global Climate Fund, which is the largest climate fund in the world at the moment, and looking at how do we support countries to actually work towards low emissions? How do we support countries towards climate resilient pathways? And my question to you would be around, how is SANBI as this access entity actually enabling the nature climate solutions? And if you have, you know, it'd be great if you can highlight some projects that SANBI has worked through, if you can mention some of the case studies that form part of the GCF process.
Thank you very much. I'm privileged to be the one that's starting. I'm looking at the panel. We work with each of the panelists here in their own right, WWF, in many projects, SANBI, and also as a department. Then when I was still working for the department or wherever I was before, Dr. Ayo, We've been together in projects that are running in the department and the projects that are running now here at SANBI for many years. I think not long ago, we celebrated our 25 years of cooperation and partnership, which shows the power of partnership. And we're looking at a number of projects, some that were initiated and implemented 25 years ago, and what they did and how they changed the landscape in biodiversity protection, rehabilitation, and also climate change related from an adaptation perspective. Work with Shamila. Good morning to Shamila, especially on issues related to resource mobilization. And I'm really privileged. And coming to perhaps the question that you're asking, indeed, I think your introduction is correct. The role of SANBI in the landscape. I think you read what SANBI is established for, but we work within a context, of this very government. I think to even have SANBI established as an institute, I mean, it's not many countries that have an institutional arrangement that has dedicated institutes specifically to deal with matters of biodiversity management, more so when it comes to knowledge management, knowledge development, building biodiversity knowledge, bringing science into policies. I think it's earlier on, I think the previous speaker referred to some of the global reports that were released. They provide evidence. So evidence-based decision-making becomes very, very important. And that's where SANBI's strength comes in terms of bringing science into policy and into action from planning perspective, from the models and the tools that we have to provide, the assessments that we conduct. That's part of our core mandate. Not long ago, I think in 2019, we released the National Biodiversity Assessment Report that also indicates where are we as a country in terms of status and trends, biodiversity and ecosystems. We monitor biodiversity from an impact perspective and how well our efforts making a difference. We are also responsible for foundations of biodiversity, the taxonomy, the inventories, the collections, the mapping, the classification. Those are the building blocks that are required for us to take informed decisions. Of course, the question that you're asking specifically is what are some of the projects on the ground that we are involved in as an institute, that we're involved in as a family. We consider ourselves as part of the bigger family, the biodiversity and conservation family. Of course, we are one of the accredited entities to be able to access the GCF. And of course, we have direct access as well to GEF, adaptation fund as well. So we've had so many projects. Some of them are in the making with partners. Some of them include WWF. We've worked with UNDP in a number of programs and projects, UNEP and others. If I may mention 2 or 3, the ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction program, very, very important, because then this one brings in, I think, the links that you're talking about, biodiversity and dealing with climate change on the ground and making a difference there. With the understanding, of course, science has already indicated that we are not talking about what is coming, it's already what we're experiencing, that climate change is here with us. And with it comes in extreme events. Those extreme events will bring in disasters in different areas of human settlements and many other areas. So the ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction program, it's one of the projects that helps us to respond appropriately on the ground. We work with those that are involved, the social partners and others, disaster management center, early warning systems come on board as part of this process. The strategic water sources is one other area that we're looking at as part of the program, ecosystem-based adaptation program for water security, especially for South Africa. It's relatively drier. Every drop counts, and therefore the protection of those catchments critical biodiversity areas that are regarded as water factories. Those ecosystems would have to be protected. So rehabilitation, restoration. What is critical in some of these projects, in actual fact, in all of them, is that we are able to achieve biodiversity outcomes while at the same time also achieving or realizing socio-economic outcomes at the same time. So job creation through that, whether they come through alien invasive clearing or they come through whatever form of rehabilitation and restoration initiatives that are done there. There's one other that deals with nature-based adaptation for transforming smallholder farming systems. I think earlier on, Kavita spoke about agroecology and innovations in those areas, because these projects are meant to provide solutions and tools, lessons, and also to change the landscape on the ground. And we document everything right from planning into implementation, even post that, just to make sure that we realize the highest impact that we're looking for. There are others that we're also looking for: groundwater and related agriculture projects from a landscape-based perspective, coastal ecological infrastructure, of course, others related to just transition projects, especially in areas that are mostly exposed in Mpumalanga in particular, from coal mining and related power generation perspectives. Here we're working with WWF. So there are a number of them. We also had adaptation fund related projects, small grants, Umgeni project, resilience project. It has done a number of things. How we work with, how do we work with local government in protecting catchments and making sure that this water security is part of that catchment rehabilitation program, agricultural practices and systems, governance in the sense of how systems need to work institutionally. So there are a number of those that one can talk about, and there's still more. But maybe for now, I must indicate some of this and say through partnerships with civil society, with private sector, other government partners in the process, that we can realize climate outcomes that we're looking for, and also biodiversity outcomes and human development outcomes in line with the theme that we're talking about today. Thank you.
Thank you, Shoni. Yes, absolutely. And thanks for that very comprehensive kind of breakdown of what SANBI is doing through GCF and the Adaptation Fund. And you're right, you've touched on several things which are really important, working with smallholder farmers all the way to under securing our water source area. And that kind of brings me to you, Ayo, because the SDGs, or the Sustainability Development Goals, were actually set up to address poverty and the social needs of people. So that ranges from education, jobs, health, social protection, etc. But one cannot address that without looking and tackling things like climate change and nature loss and how we protect it. Those two have to work. You cannot decouple them. And we've called upon several actors, government, private sector, NGOs, to actually meet us with regards to the SDGs. And I'd just like to know, this is complex. It's not complicated, it's just complex. But I wanted to get your kind of input in, what is the interplay between nature positive and the SDGs? And where do we see those synergies happening? And how do we see them actually happening on the ground? It's very easy for us to talk theoretical, to draw wonderful diagrams, but how do we see that playing out on the ground projects through the UNDP?
Thank you very much, Pab. And let me use this opportunity to say a big thank you to WWF for inviting me, and to join my brother, Mr. Shoni, who has been a great partner. And it's really also a privilege to join my dear sister, Shamila, from GSE, as well as Dr. Duplessis. It's really a pleasure meeting you, and I see this as a real opportunity for us to contribute to really making sure that we stop the next wave of biodiversity loss. Let me just start by saying the main element in the room is averting climate crisis. the triple environmental emergencies. One, biodiversity loss. Two, climate disruption. And three, escalating pollution on a daily basis. And if you look at what happened all over the world over the past 2 months, whether it's from Australia to Greece, from Greece to California in the US, it's clear that we're at an inflection point. So, and I want to start with the real quotation from our US Secretary General that says humanity is waging war on nature. And this is what he considered to be a very suicidal action, and that making peace with nature is a defining task of the 21st century, which must be the priority of everyone everywhere. And I see this as the starting point of our discussion with respect to the interlinkages across the various sustainable development goals, as well as using biodiversity as the nucleus of its engagement. Because if you look at the kind of things that we have set up globally in terms of creating a global partnership among member states, the Paris Accord is one of them. And I'm so happy that UNFCCC is one of the initiatives which is bringing our member states to the table. The second one is the UN Convention on Biological Diversity. And the third one is the UN Convention to combat diversification, combat desertification, which we think is a global action to call to action all member states to have a common position on how to address this issue. And our issue, the main objective therefore is how can we turn climate crisis into nature-based development solutions and biodiversity opulence? That is the key question. And that's why I'm so happy that we have the various actors on board. And if you look at our 25 years of working experience in South Africa, one of the things which we consider to be very important is the need for us to really build environmental governance, capacity for environmental governance, the institutional development, and also develop a kind of development exchange, because there are so many things that are happening in South Africa that the rest of the world need to know through South-South cooperation and through North-South cooperation in dealing with this issue. And I'm so happy that our partnership over the past 25 years with SAMBI, with SAMPAC, with the main department, Department of Fishery, Forestry, and the Environment, as also with the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy. Well, we are just also bringing on board Development Bank of South Africa to see how we can collectively address these issues. And that's why we think we need to use biodiversity as the nucleus of implementing the Sustainable Development Goal. Because with biodiversity, we're looking for dignified people, we're looking for prosperity, we're looking for a very hygienic planet, and also creating peace through effective partnership. So in line with this, I just want to let you know that if you look at biodiversity and humanity, in terms of farming, in terms of fishery, in terms of forestry, in terms of tourism, in terms of industry, and in terms of environmental quality services, the threat to nature is quite huge. And in South Africa, we have developed a kind of free action for what we call a month ago, Macmillan Palgrave published my book on Africa Agricultural Renaissance from Paradox to Powerhouse, where a chapter there really shows the role of agroecology in promoting biodiversity richness. And this is one of the things we have to do. Because if you look at the way we practice agriculture, where we use chemical just anyhow, we have destroyed so many of our flora, even the fauna, we destroyed them. And we need to really make sure that we use agroecology to really bring back this richness we've lost for years. And also, if you look at what we are currently doing in terms of what we are doing to assist countries to be able to access what they call blended finances all over the world, whether it's vertical fund, non-vertical fund. And this is one thing which we think we need to really work together with various partners, particularly Zambia, to really mobilize the resources for the nature. And in line with this, we have succeeded over the past few years, since 2001, we have succeeded in what they call putting intervention in place that was able to really restore 63,700 hectares of land in terms of ecosystem rehabilitation here in South Africa. And that is one of the things which we think is really very important for us to do. And also, if you look at what we are doing in sustainable land management, where over the past 5 years, we have succeeded in reclaiming what they call 10,700 hectares of land that were originally non-productive into productive assets. So this is one of the things. But let me conclude, Pab, by saying that if you look at the local homegrown solution that we are using, particularly in our national parks, this is one of the things where we are using the small grant initiative to really promote biodiversity in South Africa. We have almost about, since 2001, we have 130 projects covering about 3,000, where 3,000 households have benefited from it. And also because of this, we have been able to put about 750,000 hectares in terms of community conservation area. And also, apart from creating jobs, which is one of the things which we thought is very important for us to really put in place. And the issue of human-wildlife conflicts, it's something that is quite recurring. And we have succeeded through what we piloted in Limpopo, where we do livestock guard dogs that succeeded in making sure that the animal thing is fully protected. And also, if you look at the Chili Burst initiative, we also put in the park, the national park, Kruger's National Park, where we know elephants really destroy the plants of host communities. And what we do is that in order to make sure there's cohabitation between the elephant community as well as host community, we push, Chili Burst, we promote the use of Chili Burst, where once they hear, they smell the smell of chili, they move almost about 2-3 kilometers away from there. The same thing with beehive, to promote what we call coexistence between elephant community and host communities. We try to promote beehive engagement system. And with that, as small as a bee, once the elephant hears that noise or the smell, it's about around 5 kilometers away from there. This is the part of local innovation that we think is really very important for us. But colleagues, what we need to do is government cannot do it alone. The private sector cannot do it alone. Development partner cannot do it alone. We need a whole of society partnership approach that will help us to really do this. And I strongly believe with JSC on board, I just want to pass a message that making protection and conserving biodiversity as an integral component of your social corporate strategy is a good sound economics and a development imperative for the private sector. Thank you.
Thank you, Ayo. And thanks for those great examples. You basically capture what is a nature-based solution in some of those case studies. And before I move on to Shamila, I just ask the other members on the panel, please feel free to chip in, ask questions, make a comment, respond to what Shoni has said, respond to what Ayo has said. Shamila, Ayo touched on something really important, which is blended finance, shifting the scales around how we finance biodiversity versus where our current finance has been directed to. And, often we get asked, how do we bring biodiversity into the boardroom? And does it matter? Does biodiversity actually matter to the business community? why is it important for business to understand the risks and opportunities that are posed by biodiversity loss? And I'd like to get a couch that in something, whenever I look at the SDGs, they're always flat in 2D, but there's one graphic of the SDGs where they actually pull it up. And right at the bottom sits the biosphere, which underpins everything, including economic development. So we'd definitely love to hear your kind of thinking around business communities, understanding the importance of biodiversity loss.
Thank you very much, Pubs. And, I didn't hear anything about blended finance. I kind of lost my train of thought when Aya was talking about chilies. And I was thinking I need to use chilies more strategically. I'm going to make a note to self. But thank you very much. And thank you for having me on the panel today. I feel really like I'm the primary school kid amongst all the PhDs. It's such an important topic. And it's one I find that is difficult not to bring some level of emotion into. When we think about business in general, often our systems are quite sort of one-dimensional, two-dimensional, right? It's about the numbers, it's about what we calculate. And it often misses a heart and a soul. And essentially, we are beings that run businesses. And those beings are connected to nature. And I suppose that's not what you would have expected as my departure point. But I think that once we understand that we have that connection, that we cannot exist without nature thriving, then we need to reconsider the way we think about business. Now, business has an important role to play, and we know that it's been rooted in certain systems that have developed over time. And, just like when we go to university and we're siloed in the way in which we're taught. And if you're going to study marketing, you study marketing. And if you're studying finance, you study finance. And what is becoming more noticeable now, and I think evident broadly in the sustainability agenda, is, of course, that everything is interconnected, that we need to have more of a systemic view on things. Now, unfortunately, if we're grown up in a certain way not to think of it systemically, to try and start to inculcate that vision and that view is quite difficult. However, I think that the hope lies with what we're seeing, for example, looking at climate change and looking at the climate change agenda and looking at the fact that we have international agreements that look at that, and the scale and the speed at which we're starting to see businesses, investors and the like taking up that agenda. Once you start making it tangible, once you start making it measurable. And so it's a little bit of a roundabout way to get your point is to say, we're starting to make that measurable. And once we can start make that measurable, we can bring that into the conversations in business. I think you and I would probably both agree that what is required is a fundamental shift in the way we think, in the way we consider models, in the way we understand that these models are interconnected and are systemic in their nature. But that's not necessarily going to happen overnight. So we're sitting within a system where we're going to have to figure out how that system works and be able to talk the language of that system and being able to bring about that change while the shift in the thinking overall is starting to happen, and the evidence points that need to push that are happening as well. So I think the role of business is absolutely critical. The scene has been set. I won't recap all that you said about how completely interconnected all of these things are and the massive role that business plays both on the risk side as well as the opportunity side, in that many of the business practices we have are exacerbating the risks, there's no doubt, but within that is the opportunity. And so being able to see that opportunity and articulate it, I think, is critically important. So if we look at that from the risk and opportunity perspective, I'm not sure if it's been touched on already, but it's definitely not news to the audience we're speaking to. If we look at the World Economic Forum's global risk reports that comes out every year, and this is not a report written by WWF or written by an environmental NGO or social justice institution. This is the World Economic Forum saying that, and it ranks biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse as one of the top 5 threats that humanity is going to face in the next 10 years. So if this is not on your risk radar and agenda, then I'm not sure what is informing it. Of course, with business thinking as well comes in the notion of materiality, right? And for if there are any corporates in the room, and materiality again is absolutely not new. If you look at the way we're thinking already with sustainability thinking, if you're a JSE listed company, you already know that you're starting to think about integrated reporting, and the integrated reporting framework actually asks you to look at 6 capitals, including natural capital. And so when we're seeing these and the evidence starting to emerge, we'll be able to see and make the connections for how you need to bring this into the business agenda. So when we're looking for the referencing of risk, which is not new, I mean, virtually every business has an enterprise risk management function and a risk register and a radar. This is what we need to start bringing this into, to bring it into the systems that already exist. We're not asking people to create completely new things. We're starting to say, but you need to start thinking outside of what you've already thought and acknowledging this. So if we look at some 44 trillion of economic value generation, which is over half the world's GDP, and that is moderately or highly dependent on nature and its services, we're starting to see the numbers. So those that are saying, show me the numbers, here are some of these numbers. Addressing biodiversity loss through actions that are nature positive is an opportunity for the global economy, and it's estimated to generate around 10.1 trillion in annual business value and to create 395 million jobs by 2030. Even if we use the lens purely in South Africa, one of the biggest issues that we face is job creation, inequality, things like that. Here's an opportunity to use a nature positive outcome to actually start addressing those economic issues that, by the way, existed pre-COVID. So, we often hear about build back better. I would like to say that I support more the notion of build forward better. I don't want to go back to where we were. We know that those systems were failing. I think it's an opportunity to think about where we want to go to, rather than saying, let's build back to where we came from and do that a little bit better. That's incremental versus what we know we need to moving towards, which is a more normative view on sustainability. So action from non-governmental stakeholders, especially the private sector, is also needed to achieve an equitable, nature positive and carbon neutral world. Those are the things we need to do. We've already spoken about supply chain business practices, the need to start modifying that and reversing the decline of nature. So this is going to start averting a massive business risk. We've already set the scene for why it's a risk and create an opportunity. We know that some leading businesses are starting to become nature positive, but we certainly need a lot more. And I think part of what is necessary are those systems that show us what is possible and where it needs to go to needs to be elevated. Concepts like circular economy, circularity, we can't just criticize what's been done wrong. We need to consider clearly what needs to be done so that those models can start changing. Changing business models is not new. Businesses review strategies periodically. They do that at least annually in most cases. Those plans often do require a shift in business models as circumstances change. This is a change in what we know as the circumstances or what an overarching factor. So being able to build that in is part and parcel, I would say, of normal business practice. But what needs to change is being able to see and have a vision of how it can become possible and why it actually could be done. And then, of course, yes, we need the bold leadership to be able to do it. And then one of the other areas, of course, is that we know that in any system, incentives play a massive role. And so that enabling environment needs to be created to help businesses to be doing that. And right now we see more disincentives in the system by the way of that, certain subsidies and things that exist that are actually creating destructive practices and incentivizing worse. So once we start looking at how those things can be reduced, how one starts to change it, how one starts changing the conversation around that. And again, I go back to my premise that once you can see how to build a future that's different, you start making it easier for people to let go of the ways of thinking and the models that are not going to serve the future that we would like to build. So those things, and looking at the practical ways to do that. And when we talk about nature positive, even the language I feel that we use when we're talking about this needs to actually make a little bit more sense to business and not sound like something that is, kind of loony left. And so when we bring that in, it will become catalytic, I think, because you just need one or two of those businesses to start showing they can do it differently and those leaders to be held up and to be held to account. And we start seeing those shifts because we're also seeing changes fundamentally in the way governance, for example, is considered. So the highest authorities in business is the governing body, your board. And there's increasingly now a perspective that boards need to develop greater competence and understanding sustainability. And so you're actually starting to see that change. And I think once that starts to shift, that those boards start asking the right questions of companies, start engaging on strategy with the different lens, those are the things we're going to be able to start seeing where these narratives that we're building on the risk and the opportunity will become hopefully a lot more mainstream in the boardroom. And I just want to end off then perhaps with three things about nature risk becoming material for business and three ways in which we can consider that. So when the business depends directly on nature for operations, for its supply chain performance and for property and asset values, physical security, and for its business continuity. Secondly, when the direct and indirect impacts of business activities on nature loss can trigger negative consequences, such as losing customers or entire markets, legal action. I mean, right now, there are actually databases tracking, for example, the amount of litigation that is arising on the back of climate change related concerns, litigation directed at even regulators and things like that, saying you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing, basically. And of course, we know that there's been a few that have been leveled at companies as well. So legal action, and that's just one. What happens is we start valuing biodiversity differently. I think we can pretty much copy and paste some of those actions. Legal action, regulatory changes that affect financial performance. Now, and on that one, I mean, just look at, and not just necessarily regulatory action, but on looking at the losses. Look at what's happened in the COVID world we've had up to now. We can calculate those losses, and those are mounting continually. The amount of money that we have to plow into dealing with social inequity in order to just give people basic water and things like that that they need to help manage in a pandemic like this. All it's done is shown just how bad our historic underinvestment in these issues are. So it brings together the need to meet the SDGs, the need to be able to do that. We wouldn't have to go to ask for more money and borrow and leave governments more heavily indebted, which ultimately puts taxpayers and economies at a risk. If we weren't in that situation, if we value nature more, we probably wouldn't have the bigger and as we know already now, the growing threat of zoonotic diseases and the like, which have financial implications. So if nothing else, understand that it's creating a financial risk. And then lastly, when nature loss causes disruption to society and the markets within which businesses operate, and it can manifest in both those physical and those market risks. And at least the work that's been done on climate change, because the TCFD, for example, was actually mandated to come into creation by the Financial Stability Board, we can start seeing that hopefully it poses a good kind of way in which other things can start to be considered from the environmental and social context as well, and start pricing adequately for those, so that those business models that historically have undervalued and not priced in the cost to economy and society will start to change. So I'm going to leave it at that, Pubs. I'm sure we'll have more questions later. Thank you.
Thank you, Shamla. And you touched on key things around, bringing biodiversity into the boardroom, allowing for that space where business depends directly on the operations and supply chains. It directly depends on what we call natural capital, valuable assets. And, that brings me to you, Bone, in that people don't always see that we have to look at this as a system. It's always seen as very fragmented or disparate pieces, but it actually does function within a system. And we've talked about, the social context, and we've talked about the climate context, and we've talked about the business context, but we actually haven't thought about the system, and I think by way of example, if a nature-based solution has to look at a system-wide movement and change. It cannot look at just disparate, fragmented parts, because then eventually, the parts create more than the whole, where you actually want the whole to function. And if you can talk a little bit about, particularly in the South African context, where all of our speakers have mentioned water. At some point, it is one of the most valuable assets we have that nature provides. Access to clean, water, as well as water for our human activities, becomes such an important part. And managing that resource is going to take a systems approach. We cannot measure that resource with a single lens focus. So I thought, if you can talk about the role that the strategic water source partnerships have played, and tie that in very nicely to what Shamila has talked about, the role of business and the understanding on what that has catalyzed in being a system-wide process to address a nature-based challenge.
Thank you, Pubs. And I think, with speakers that have gone before me, it's very clear that we're sitting with an institutional or organizational and sector ecosystem that works in synergy with one another, because there's a lot of overlap, and a lot of what I'm about to say has its genesis out of partnerships with parastatals like SANBI, with funders like UNDP, and certainly with business. So in 1995, we had a visionary minister of water affairs, Professor Kauda Asmal, who was listening to a WWF-funded researcher, Dr. Guy Preston, about the impact of alien plants in sucking up water, alien plants, invasive alien trees that serve no commercial or other ecological purpose other than to damage the functioning of ecosystems. And out of that arose a partnership between WWF and the minister, in which Working for Water, a massive large-scale program was put in place, a comprehensive program of clearing aliens across South Africa. Over 3 million hectares of catchment has been cleared, with over 10 million hectares of follow-up clearing. This has accumulated budgets of over the years of 30 billion South African rands. So this is not insignificant. And in the process, many tens of thousands, perhaps as close to 100,000 jobs have been, or employment opportunities have been created. So this shows at a large scale what can be done when these minds come together. Now, in 2013, WWF, together with CSIR, the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research in South Africa, did a study in which was found that 1 out of every 2 raindrops that fall in South Africa, so half of all rain, falls on only 10% of South Africa's land surface area. And this led to the definition of what was strategic water source areas, because clearly that 10% that received half of South Africa's rainfall was disproportionately important. And with subsequent work involving SANBI and other partners, the Water Research Commission and others, the refinement of these water source areas took place. So for WWF South Africa, this has become a very, very a strong focus of the work that we do. Inside these water source areas, of course, is where the rubber really hits the road. I spoke about alien clearing that needs to happen. And of course, some of the work supported by the state's expanded public works program has significantly contributed to clearing, but in continuity and in terms of targeted clearing in these strategic water source areas, we've also established significant partnerships with the corporate sector in order to enable the work to happen on the ground. Out of these projects, of course, when you fell alien trees, you're sitting with wood that needs to be removed from those systems in one way or the other in a cost-effective way. And in the process, a number of jobs and business opportunities have been created for small business in, for example, chipping to create mulch of that wood that can then be used as in the agricultural sector. We have programs that are running sustainable charcoal production programs that are leading, hopefully, to certification by FSC. And then, of course, there's the restoration of catchments where indigenous plants are grown in nurseries that are run by people who are rallying around to also make use of these opportunities to improve their livelihoods and create income. So all of these things sort of dovetail from the highest level all the way down to right on the ground, where the experience of an individual who wakes up in the morning, puts on their overall and protective gear and steps out to go and do some charcoal production or clearing or whatever. These things are all very, very neatly encapsulated and in striving for the sustainable development goals around which we all rally. So I think, bearing in mind the constraints of time, maybe also just to land on the issue of partnerships that was mentioned by every speaker before me. this cannot happen with government doing its job alone. It cannot happen with business doing its job alone, or with NGOs doing their job alone, or with funders sitting on the sidelines knowing what needs to be done, but having no way of making it happen. This requires working very, very closely together in joint fashion. I'll leave it there for the moment, Tavs.
Thank you, Mone. And just listening to you, I come to the realization that systems are complex, not complicated, and we can change them. But most importantly is that system changes and collective action depend on partnerships, and they move at the pace of trust. And that's something that everybody said here, is that we function together because we move at the pace of trust. And that is something we have to believe in, and that I think will serve us in good stead going forward to address the nature positive issue and actually get there. Unfortunately, there have been quite a few questions coming through, but due to our time limits, I'm going to have to ask that and apologize to our audience for not actually following up with those questions. A lot of them have been answered by our panelists. Thank you so much for your effort. And then just as a way of a wrap up, on what folks have said, and I'd like to start this by saying, taking a quote from another millennial, which is Greta Tunberg, and recently at an award ceremony, she said, don't just hope for things to get better. Don't just believe that things are hopeless. When you start acting on the ground, when you start implementing results and positive results come of your actions, then you'll be amazed, you will see hope everywhere. And I think that's what we're hearing today from all our panelists, that, you know what, yes, it's a big problem. It's complex. Yes, we have to start thinking in circular feedback loops. We have to start listening and actually voicing with a very authentic, honest voice. We have to change the language when we speak to business, because we need to let it land with them around the significance and the importance, bar all the challenges of biodiversity and the role that business and the private sector plays. And, the late Professor Bob Scholes said to me one day, and I said to him, this is taking so long to make an impact. And he said, my dear, this is long-term work, and it's going to be intergenerational. You're not going to be the one that's going to solve it. And I think those words ring true, in that it's not just intergenerational, but it is also a collective, collaborative co-creation that is going to happen for us to get to those nature positive goals. And with that, I'd like to say thank you very much to our esteemed panelists for your time. To Kavita, unbelievable, our keynote speaker, for kind of setting the scene, for your time, your energy, and your input from everybody. And to our audience, for bearing with us through all of the technical glitches this morning. Thank you for staying around, and for your attention and for your attendance. To end of the session, we will be running a very short engagement survey. Please hang around and answer that. It'll be great for us to kind of get those responses from you. And then lastly, we ask you to actually come back tomorrow, because the Living Planet Conference does not end today. We actually have a wonderful session tomorrow and on Thursday, looking specifically at biodiversity and finance, biodiversity and natural infrastructure, and also then most importantly, biodiversity and indigenous knowledge. Plus, you don't want to miss the LPC Awards, which Mornay mentioned earlier. And with that, I'd like to say thank you everyone once again. Stay safe, take care, and we got this. We can actually fix this. We got this one. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.